All right. Good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Kelly Booz, and I am the director of our American Federation of Teachers Share My Lesson website. I am so excited to get this webinar and conversation started on the 1619 project and examining some of the essays with some incredible speakers. When this project came out, I really wanted to have Nikole Hannah-Jones join us for one of our webinars, and I'm so excited that we were able to make that happen. Before I pass this over to Randy Weingarten, our president of the American Federation of Teachers, I just wanted to go over a couple housekeeping items. I know some of you are frequent flyers with us at our Share My Lesson webinars, so you probably know the drill, but just so everybody is aware, we use a group chat quite a bit. We want to hear from you. We want you to pass notes to each other and share some of your thoughts. So please go ahead and open up that group chat widget. Let us know where you're joining us from. We will do a facilitated question and answer session at the end of this. So if you do have questions about the project or for our speakers, use that Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen, or it may be kind of in a side menu if you're on a smart device to send in questions. And if we have time, we'll get to it. We will live tweet this session, so feel free to activate Twitter if you're on it and join us for that conversation. There are some links to resources and as well as the publication itself, so you can access that here. And then finally, I know a number of you come to our webinars and like to get a professional development certificate verifying your participation today, which is fantastic. Here's some explanation of how you can download that PDF certificate. And then finally, I'll just mention sometimes when we're doing webinars, there may be some technical issues or audio problems. If that happens, go ahead and use that Q&A widget and our staff is on and will reply to you. But more often than not, it usually means refreshing your browser, and that solves 90% of the issues, that and just making sure you're using a Chrome if possible. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my boss at the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten. It's hard to find a better education, labor, public leader who spent more time being such a great advocate for teachers, school staff, nurses, higher education professors, higher education staff, as well as public employees. So Randy, thank you so much for being here and leading us. And as a social studies teacher, I know that this topic is near and dear to your heart.
Thank you, Kelly. And I want to thank Nikole and Khalil and Fareed for basically teaching us and this webinar. And I share your excitement, Kelly, in terms of the we're doing this webinar with the Pulitzer Center. We're examining the essays from the 1619 project, and it's a testament to both Nikole's brilliance and her sense of lived and shared experiences that we have one of the other contributors who is going to be part of this this webinar. I want to just make a couple of comments and then turn it over to our enormously gifted moderator and speakers. During the presidential inauguration, a few weeks after the Capitol insurrection, after the attempted coup, before I heard Amanda Gorman's poem, I would have said, as I did in many different places, that we were in an inflection point. And it was pretty dangerous walking into that, the inauguration. I happened to be in Washington on January 6th. Our office is very close to the Capitol. You could watch what was going on as the the rioters mobbed the Capitol. But in listening to Amanda Gorman and the stunning poem that she wrote and delivered, she acknowledged this moment as uncomfortable, precarious, but hopeful. She found a way to both be honest and hopeful. characterizing it as a moment of growth. And that if we are brave enough to be the light, we can emerge as a union that is not perfect, but one that has purpose. And that resonated with me and so many others who are pursuing, as imperfect as we are, justice, economic justice, education justice, climate justice, racial justice. But what I think we see in the 1619 Project is essentially that the country has to see its history in all of its manifestations, and that history cannot be whitewashed. And when it is whitewashed, we do a disservice to not only those who have been enslaved, not only those who felt the bondage of this terrible history, but we do a disservice to everyone else who wants to walk away from it. We stop looking at a lived experience. And in order for us to be a more perfect union, in order for us to fight for everyone in America's ability to thrive, freedom to thrive, which rests on opportunity and justice, we need to actually understand the inequity, and we need to actually walk in everyone's shoes. And in some ways, what the 1619 Project does is that it forces those who do not want to see. It forces everyone to be seen. And so that is why the AFT has partnered with the Pulitzer Center on the 1619 Project, because we know that an honest and robust education is the only way to prepare our kids to go into this world as thoughtful and transformational stewards. And so some might say, is justice work really the work of a union? Of course it is. Our community is our responsibility. Justice is our responsibility. Everyone wants good schools, good education for our kids, hopefully in a way that is integrated and diverse, where we're focused on the well-being of all. But we have to fight as educators for all people so that all people can thrive. We have to be about the full community. And it's not simply fighting the attacks like those by Donald Trump as he tried to change the curriculum, as he tries to push what was misnamed, quote, patriotic education. I frankly call it propaganda. But it doesn't stop with Trump and what he tried to do in California and elsewhere. Think about Tom Cotton last year introducing legislation, that would make any school who used the 1619 Project materials ineligible for federal professional development grants. Cotton called the series a racially divisive and revisionist account of history that threatens the integrity of the Union. What threatens the integrity of the Union is that Tom Cotton does not want to see the real history of the Union. This is a moment, like the Scopes trial was a moment, in terms of really understanding what has happened in our history and what we need to do about it. There's nothing unpatriotic about a clear-eyed view of our nation's past. Indeed, understanding the problems and the failures at the center of our nation is to actually not just take history seriously, but play an active role in making it better, in nation building. And so thanks to AFT Shared My Lesson, which has been a platform that we started. Thank you to Kelly Booz for administering it and leading it so well in this moment of COVID. But we are trying to get these invaluable and nuanced lesson plans about the 1619 Project directly to educators when they need it most to help them tackle these conversations. And our hope through this partnership with the Pulitzer Center, whether it is on the work on the 1619 project or so many of the other things that we have done and projects that we have lifted up in this Black History Month, our hope is that through this process and this partnership, we can help further honest conversations around our country's history and subsequently our present, inform our present, and hopefully our future in our classrooms, in our communities, and in our organizations. And so I just want to say one more time, thank you to Nikole Hannah-Jones for bringing this project to bear. Thank you for being my shiro and so many of our shiros. Thank you, Fareed, for wanting to do this partnership with us. And I turn it over to our friend and our colleague, Fareed Mustafi from the Pulitzer Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us and for this wonderful opening and grounding in today's conversation. The Pulitzer Center, where I work, our mission is to elevate public engagement with underreported issues through direct support for journalism and through education and outreach programs. And in our education department, where I work, we believe that by engaging with underreported stories and the journalists who cover them and historians, like we have today guests who are journalists and historians, that students will cultivate the critical thinking, communication, and analysis skills that they need to inform themselves, to cultivate empathy, and to take action. I'm so excited today to talk about connecting students with a project that truly aligns with the Pulitzer Center's education mission and goals, the 1619 Project. The project commemorates the 400th anniversary of a moment in August 1619 where 20 enslaved Africans arrived on a ship in Port Comfort, Virginia, and it commemorates that moment by examining slavery's modern legacy and reframing the way we understand this history and the contributions of Black Americans to this nation. We're going to be doing a deep dive into two of the essays today, but let's launch a quick poll to see generally how familiar is the group here with the 1619 Project. So if we could launch that poll. Are you very familiar? Maybe you've read most of it. Some of you might have used it in your classes. Have you seen some of the articles or listened to some of the podcasts? You heard a bit, or is this the first you're learning about it? And if so, hopefully you'll get some really exciting content today that will spark you to go and research a little bit more. So why don't we close out this poll in the next 5, 3, 1, and let's take a look and see who's in our community today. And wow, what a great start. We have folks joining us from all different connections to the project, but it looks like many of us are familiar, so that's exciting. I invite you already to start adding your questions for our guests, Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, for Nikole Hannah-Jones to the Q&A function. We'll have plenty of time for your questions, especially those of you who are already familiar. I'm sure you have some. But for those of you who are just learning, let me tell you a little bit about the project. It launched with the publication of a magazine in August 2019 that includes 18 essays from journalists and historians, 2 of whom we are so lucky to have with us today. And those essays explore the lasting impact of slavery on healthcare, the criminal justice system, financial systems, city planning and traffic patterns, American music, politics, sugar consumption in the United States, and more. The magazine also includes 15 creative works that reflect the stories and emotions from underrepresented moments in U.S. history, and those creative works are on a timeline. Also part of the project are 5 podcast episodes and a resource for elementary age students that includes an interview with a historian, myths that are often taught or that have been taught about slavery, and PDF copies of all of the resources that I'm mentioning now are available at pulitzercenter.org/1619, as are the curricular resources our education team developed as the official education partners, proud partners for this project. And those include reading guides, lesson plans, and extension activities. Since the 1619 project launched last year, educators and administrators nationwide have connected with us to share ways that the project has supported their standards and curricula. We've heard how the project has increased student engagement in a variety of classes and grade levels, inspired students to conduct research about their own cities and communities, supported students in processing current events, and helped students make connections between their classwork and their lived experiences. I know it's made me think a lot about my education, the history I was taught, and those moments that really changed my understanding of the world. As we dig into the conversation today, we want to start with one more poll that really can connect to any of the content from this project. And it's the question, for you personally and the community you are a part of, how well do you think your U.S. history classes represented your experience of the life in the United States? And for those of you educators out there who might be thinking of your students, you might answer this question for them. How well do you think that the history classes that those students are engaging with are representing their experiences? Let's hold that poll for another 5. 2, and let's see where we are right now. And looking at the poll, I'd encourage you in the chat, if you'd like to share moments where you were really surprised or excited or inspired in history, moments where you were frustrated, disappointed, moments, maybe things that you learned outside of those classes that you wish you'd learned in those classes. Please share them in the chat, and maybe that will help us as we're starting to anchor the power that we have as educators to hopefully get some different answers from our students when they're in these webinars one day. In response to inspiration from teachers who want their students seeing some different history than maybe they're seeing now, we've actually launched a really exciting initiative called the 1619 Project Education Network. It's open to educators, administrators, content specialists, curriculum supervisors, and also educators working with adults in jails, prisons, or youth detention facilities. We're looking for a cohort of 40 education professionals who receive grants of $50,000 to support exploration of key questions of racial justice and other pressing issues by writing in units, sharing units in multiple classes that use the 1619 Project and other journalism and historical resources. We're also hoping that this community will be a network of support to ensure that we're all learning best from each other, so that in the end, all of the units developed as part of the network can be shared publicly for teachers worldwide to use. So I'll put the link to that in the chat in just a moment, but we encourage you, the applications are due Monday, March 15th. So we hope today's discussion about 2 essays from the project will inspire you to apply, or maybe to collaborate on an application together. That's something we really want to encourage. We also hope today's discussion will leave all of us with new information that will help us better understand our history and how we can support ourselves and our students in understanding the present and imagining an even better future. Today, we're so privileged to be joined by Nikole Hannah-Jones, who first imagined this project, who guided the development of the project, and who wrote the project's opening essay, The Idea of America. Hannah-Jones is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and won a 2020 Pulitzer Prize for the essay we'll discuss today. We're also joined by Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who wrote the essay Sugar for this project. He's a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School and a Suzanne Young Murray professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for being here. So I'll start with a question for Nikole. Nikole, will you tell us about when you learned about the year 1619 and walk us through how that led to the inspiration for this project?
Thank you, Fareed, for that introduction, and Randy as well. And thank you to AFT for hosting the conversation, and to all the educators who have joined today. It did my heart good to see how many of you are already familiar with the project, and I'm excited to introduce it to those of you who are less familiar. And it also is, it is kind of deeply personal that I'm having this conversation with you all today, because I learned about 1619 as a high school student. My high school offered a one-semester Black Studies elective. It was called From the African American Experience. And I took that course and for the first time in my life was exposed to all of, significant contributions that Black Americans had made. And I remember, being shocked that we had actually contributed a lot to the world and to America because we had never been taught that. And it made me realize that, what we're taught in school is someone telling us, someone in authority telling us what they consider to be important. And so as a student, you assume that if it were important, they would teach it to you. And so if you haven't been taught it, you don't think it's either you think it's not important or that it doesn't exist. And so in this class where I was suddenly being exposed to history that was dating back to ancient Africa and American history, I became really obsessed with learning that history and trying to fill in all of these gaps, and empowered by actually seeing myself in the curriculum and in the history of my own country for the first time. And so I would ask the teacher of that class, Mr. Ray Dial, to give me books to read. And every time he gave me a book, I would devour the book and ask for another book. And one of the books he gave me was a book called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And I actually thought that Before the Mayflower was kind of evoking our African history before we arrived to the United States. And it was about 30 pages in where I saw the year 1619. And it said that 1619 was the year the first Africans were sold into Virginia. And I just remember being absolutely shocked by that. I didn't understand that the title of the book was referring to American history. And I realized, even as a 16 or 17-year-old, that erasure had been intentional. That how could you not acknowledge or have ever taught us the beginning of American slavery, one of the most fundamental institutions, the institution that nearly tore our country apart in the 1860s. So that's how I came. But it was not only was it an elective course, so a course that most students were not, would never take, but also it was a course of self-study where I was asking for books to read and came across that date. So I've thought about the year 1619. It's been a few years since I was in high school. I've thought about it since then, and it really helped. It symbolically, of course, was just as powerful as the truth of. It gave us kind of a origin story, but symbolically understood the 1619 and the fact that we had never been taught that date really stood in for a long pattern of erasure. And I have thought about it all of that time, not only because that date in and of itself was powerful, but that people decided they did not want us to know that date. And I understood that that was intentional. So that's how I came across that date. And that's how long I've been thinking about it.
And maybe I'll bring in Professor Mohammed, as you were, hearing about the project and invited to contribute. Can you walk us through how you arrived at the idea for the essay Sugar as a part of this project?
Yeah, so I had the privilege of being part of an early brainstorming session where Nikole and a few editors at the Times invited about 24 historians to really think about what an issue like this should include. And a lot of amazing ideas, but as you can imagine, with any project that has constraints in terms of pages and topics that can be reasonably covered, the editors had to make some choices. So among the many suggestions, I suggested that in thinking about slavery thinking about the history of slavery, but also thinking about the context of slavery in North and South America, sugar was the sort of beginning of it all. And my big mouth got me in trouble. And so I was later asked to contribute that essay to the project. And it's been great. It's been a great ride.
And maybe to help some of the audience that might be less familiar with the essay, the quote that's in the reading guide that we provide paints that image of what it's like. It's a piece of your writing that looks at what it's like to cultivate sugar and how difficult it was. And I know I learned that it was not accessible for a very long time to the majority of people. Will you tell us a little bit more about how you structured it from that moment where, and the essay really brings us into the present?
Yeah, so I mean, because of the way that the 1619 Project was organized, and certainly Nikole can talk about this choice, was to anchor each essay with a current or contemporary resonance, something that made sense to people, and to kind of reveal the surprising connection to the role of race and racism, some of which had to do with slavery, some of which was more contemporary, like universal health care, for example. So that was the framing of each essay. And in my particular essay, the question was, to what degree do we start with sugar as this commodity that Americans consume way too much of? I mean, like more than any other part of the globe, with terrible health consequences. So it started with thinking about how to frame the essay in relationship to that contemporary problem of the overconsumption of sugar, and then to go back and see where we ended up. Turns out that, like you, I had not given that much thought to how difficult sugar cultivation had been, that it had started 10,000 years ago, and that because it required intense labor, and primarily it's very easy to understand, the cane stalk grows basically as a plant. It's not too much different than a weed, meaning it doesn't take much to grow the cane stalk. But it takes a whole lot more effort to get the juice out of the plant when it's ripe so that it doesn't spoil. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort to turn that juice into crystallized sugar. So essentially, this thing existed in the world, this plant existed in the world for a long time before you could harness abundant land, labor, and the right temperature. The reason why sugar doesn't exist much in the United States in terms of cultivation, both today and in the past, is because it needs to be in a certain climate. So that leaves us with Louisiana, Florida, and Texas as the two main sugar producers today. And it was Louisiana where this sort of all began. The fact of it needing so much labor meant that the productivity required to make sure that huge swaths of cane production would yield massive profits for plantation owners and enslavers meant that people's lives were essentially expendable in the process of cultivating it. This was most especially true in the Caribbean, in the sugar islands of Jamaica, Barbados, in South America, in Guyana, in many parts of the Caribbean and South America. People's lives were cut short dramatically as a result of sugar cultivation, and might not live much longer than 7 years from the time they entered the sugar fields until they left in a grave. So it was an incredibly brutal form of slavery. It essentially underwrote the wealth of European colonization in the quote-unquote New World from the end of the 15th century all the way through the period of course, the United States Civil War, which was the last gasp of plantation slavery in the New World.
I invite educators who, like me on the call, might be continuing to receive new information to add it to the chat, and maybe how you might connect it to students. Nikole, I'll come to you, and I'd love to think about your essay, and also that in that brainstorming session, what are some in the research for 1619, some of those facts and details that really stood out to you that you really wanted audiences, especially student audiences, to take away from the project?
Yeah, thank you. So the entire concept of the project, the conceit of the project, is that slavery touches, in some ways, almost every aspect of modern American life, and yet it's been rendered asterisk to the American story and really invisibilized. And so in this brainstorming session, where I invited all of these historians who work in the area of race and slavery and the period of racial apartheid that followed slavery, was to think about some modern institution and then to use history and historiography to actually trace that institution back to slavery, and institutions that would be surprising. So as Khalil said, sugar. Historian Kevin Cruz wrote about traffic patterns in Atlanta, and Matt Desmond wrote about capitalism. And my essay was on democracy. And many of us at least acknowledge in a little bit of our history textbooks what we get about slavery was that slavery was profitable. And so we acknowledge that Black labor built some wealth in this country. But what we don't acknowledge is that Black people played a much more fundamental role in our nation, and that was actually building democracy. And that we were not actually founded as a democracy. We were founded as a slave society where the men who drafted the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights were all Virginians, and they were all enslavers. And that Black people actually looked at those words of the Declaration in particular, words that most of us can say without looking at the words on the paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. Black people took those words, written by a man who owned human beings, including his own children, and said those words apply to us, and we are actually going to fight to make those words true. And that has been the role that Black Americans have played and continue to play if we look even at the most recent presidential election. So that's really what my essay was exploring. And I'll say, as I was researching the essay, a couple things that surprised me, even someone who has studied this history for a long time and has been always very skeptical of these American narratives, is I was surprised it would also be the most controversial part of my essay, but the extent to which slavery played in the American Revolution and the motives of particularly Southern colonists, and particularly Southern colonists in Virginia, for deciding that they actually wanted to join a revolution and become independent from Britain. I had been taught the same narrative that the heart of the revolution was Boston, and that the people who wanted to leave Britain wanted to leave over tyranny. And not that part of that the actual heart of the revolution was Virginia, and that these documents and even the idea of republicanism comes out of Virginia, and that they want the freedom to practice tyranny against the people who have allowed them to become rich, which are enslaved people. So that was a surprising fact. And also the fact about that Abraham Lincoln, when he was thinking about issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, didn't actually want Black people to be in the country after slavery, that he felt that Black people were incompatible with the democracy that was intended to be a white man's democracy, and that he actually wanted to try to recolonize or just colonize Black people in either a nation in Africa or in South America. I knew that I had read Lincoln's writings before, and I knew that he didn't believe in Black equality, but I didn't know that he actually didn't think that Black people should continue to exist in America outside of being exploitable labor. So that was definitely surprising. And then I guess the most surprising thing for me personally was the idea of Black patriotism. And when you think about that, the most sane and rational thing Black people could and should have done after the end of slavery was to leave this country, because there would be no reason to believe that a country that enslaved you in chattel slavery for 250 years would treat you as equal citizens. And yet Black people refused to do that, and actually felt an intense patriotism and drive to force this country to live up to its ideals, because their ancestors' bones were buried in this land, and they were going to claim ownership over a country that didn't even grant them citizenship until the 14th Amendment. It actually helped me understand patriotism in a way for my own self and for other Black Americans that I hadn't understood before.
And those are themes, thank you so much, that it came through. I mean, what we've learned from students is that pride and that frustration in both were really resonating with students nationwide. And I'll add a blog to the chat in a moment if you want to see some of the students' work we saw in the past year. But something that you mentioned that might be helpful for educators who aren't as familiar with the essays is you can hear that this essay is touching on events that will be very familiar to students: the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, and highlighting some things that might surprise them about things they think they know about. I'll turn it over to you, Professor Mohammed. I'm curious, for you in your research, were there moments like that where you, the moments for you, there was something surprising that you learned that you wanted people to know, maybe something you thought you knew and then you learned a little bit differently in your research? I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. I was muting because my phone rang. Sorry.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, yes, for me, I mean, I'll just be frank. The most surprising aspect was when I was interviewing a curator of a museum in Louisiana who runs something called the Whitney Plantation Museum. It's the first and only museum dedicated to the history of sugar enslavement, the cultivation of sugar. This institution, literally this plantation, was around from 1752 as an operating entity until 1975. And so I'm interviewing the curator there, and she tells me that just down the road where I had passed a correctional facility called the Nelson Correctional Facility, which was kind of an irony, like the proximity of a former plantation to a current prison facility. She said, "Oh yeah, and at Angola, which is AKA Louisiana State Penitentiary, the largest penitentiary by landmass, that they still cultivate sugar and they sell cane syrup in the gift shop." And she sent me a link to an article about it. I would never have connected the two dots, and certainly when I wrote about it, it was still just a very powerful moment of having seen with my own eyes this relationship of slavery to mass incarceration to the continued exploitation of Black people. I also, while visiting there and doing some reporting on this museum as a way of talking about how Americans do and don't remember the history of slavery, I met a tour guide who, following her while she was doing her thing, the museum was open at the time, and so I was just walking around. She pulls out her cell phone, and she's talking to a group of overwhelmingly white visitors, but not only white. In fact, I met a Black couple from my hometown of Chicago and talked to them as well. But she pulls out her cell phone, and she's pointing to a figure. Later, I learned that she was she described in that moment that she was telling the story of her uncle, who had in fact worked there in the 1960s and 70s. So again, this proximity to lived Black experiences in the present to the infrastructure of enslavement is not an abstraction for Black people. I mean, by no stretch of the imagination. And I think I would never have, for someone who was trained to know a lot of American history from the colonial period to the present, I mean, I have a specialization, and so there are a lot of things I'd have to relearn because I learned them 15 years ago. Nevertheless, I came about as close to seeing up close what slavery was really about than at anything I'd ever read in a book. And those were two very powerful, surprising moments for me.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking of a million more questions, but I know that my colleagues here on the call have some even better ones. So I'll close with one more for both of you, and then we'll turn it over to our colleagues on the call here. And that is what advice do you have for educators, or hopes you have for educators who are thinking about ways to connect the 1619 project and the themes from the project to their students?
You go first, Nikole.
So before coronavirus shut down real life, I was traveling all over the country, often for the Pulitzer Center, meeting with high school teachers and their students and the way that they were using the project. And it was both deeply humbling and also just beautifully gratifying. I saw educators who were having students write their own response essays to my essay on democracy. I met a teacher in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, who was using Khalil's essay in his foods class to really talk about the modern diet and what goes in. We don't have slavery anymore, but we certainly have low-wage workers who have very few rights, who are producing the food that goes on our tables every day. I met music teachers who were teaching Wesley Morris's music essay and the music podcast and using that to talk about how Black music is American music. So there were teachers who were using Dwayne Bett's redaction poem, to have students create their own redaction poems using founding documents. So it was really amazing to see all of the ways that educators were embracing the project and teaching it in different ways. And then, of course, all of the social studies teachers who were using the 1619 project as the supplementary material that it should be. Of course, this project cannot replace standard social studies curriculum, though I would argue standard social studies curriculum should be replaced. But it supplements. And what it really does at its best is gets us to question origin stories and who decides what stories we should learn and what history is important and valuable, and why do they make those decisions, and what interest do those decisions and stories serve. And what it does for students who would tell me, I see myself in this story. This project explained why my neighborhood looks the way that it does, and explains why my family has struggled even though they work really hard. That, to me, is the highest calling of education. It is one, to make us question, but also to make us understand. And that's how I hope that educators will continue to use the project, not to indoctrinate students in another narrative, but to actually help students to question all the narratives that we learn and to learn to write their own.
Yeah, that was great, Nikole. And I'll just add that I think that educators ought to also think of the 1619 project as a continuing education opportunity for themselves. I teach future teachers. I used to teach them when I was teaching at Indiana University, that has a substantial school of education. At the Harvard Kennedy School, I annually have a number of current educators who are getting master's or doctorate degrees at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And frankly, my students will be very honest. They'll say, we didn't learn a lot about the history of race or racism, and yet they've been teaching for 10, 20 years, which means that the importance of the 1619 project to me is as much about what teachers need to learn that they didn't learn in order to be more effective educators of their students. And the on-ramps in this particular project between poetry and verse, between history essays, offers a lot of ways for a teacher to take their new knowledge and think creatively, as Nikole so eloquently described and has seen out in her own journey, to do all kinds of things. But teachers can't be good at what they do if they don't understand the material themselves. And I think that's what the 1619 project offers people. It's not the beginning and the end of the learning process. It's really a call to action to begin to fill in for yourself the things that you just weren't well taught. None of us were.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Kelly with some of our questions.
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and putting even more context and richness behind the publication itself. But I'm going to actually turn it over to Randy, who I know wanted to jump in and do a question. And she wanted to stay on also to learn some more. And she's got a question or a comment that she wanted to add. And then we'll jump into some other questions.
So we want to hear, Kelly, all the other questions. But I know the question that, several people have asked, and I think, Nikole, you actually, we were talking about this before the webinar started as well. There's been huge pushback, not just by a Tom Cotton or a Donald Trump. They did a whole big, purported committee from the Ed Department trying to whitewash the 1619 project. But the questions I have is, one is the obvious one. Why do you think there's been this huge pushback from about teaching the history of America pre-1776, particularly the lived experience of those who were enslaved? And second, what do you think we can do to help ensure that educators have the freedom to teach, the space, the latitude to be able to teach this work?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, when I've been thinking a lot, this entire project is a project really about memory. It's a project, of course, that uses history, but it's about this national memory. And national memory is really about a master narrative. And the master narrative that we have received. So how do we build a national memory? It's built through social studies textbooks. It's built through popular culture. It's built through monuments. It's built through speeches that politicians and others give. And that narrative has been that we are an exceptional nation founded on exceptional ideas. We are a country that, even when we have stumbled, has always been about freedom and democracy. Well, Black people are very inconvenient to that narrative. And the history of Black people are very inconvenient to that narrative. And so we have treated slavery as an asterisk, as kind of marginal, because we can't really grapple with that founding hypocrisy that deeply unsettles the master narrative, or as I say, the master's narrative. So to see something, I think it's not just, so everything that's in the project is not new to people who have been studying the field for the last 30 years, right? We cite deeply the work of historians, of respected academic historians. But it is to have that narrative unsettled in the New York Times, which is really the citadel of like elite white power in this country. That to me is where so much of this pushback is coming, is that this would be a popularized narrative that would go out to the masses and really force us to expand that lens in a way that does not speak to a narrative of exceptionalism, but it speaks to what I would consider a more accurate truth about what our country was really built on. And we saw really the biggest pushback when it became clear that so many schools were adopting the 1619 Project and teaching the 1619 Project, because then there was a fear that our children will get a narrative other than says our founders are demigods who created the greatest country on the face of the earth. So I think a lot about this quote from David Blight's book on Civil War and memory. And it was a Union veteran who was very disturbed about how the idea of unification was coming to basically forgive the Confederacy for what it did and downplay it. And he said that they're trying to write history backward. That's how we're taught history, right? We're taught a group of facts that makes us the country that we want to pretend that we are versus actually tells us about the country that we were. And you can't understand the country that we saw on January 6th based on the history that we've been taught. That is not an accurate portrayal of the country that we are. So this is really a fight over narrative, who has the power to shape the way that we think about our country and what narrative we will put forth. So it's not surprising. I mean, I know, Randy, you've been an educator for a very long time. You know the textbook wars, the wars over what we can teach our kids, whose narratives, the laws against ethnic studies. This fight goes back a very long time. The 1619 Project is just the most current iteration of a really long battle. And even the legislation being introduced against the project is not new, though it certainly is new, I think, or it should be deeply disturbing that they're trying to actually strip funding. The government is trying to strip funding away from school districts for teaching a work of journalism simply because they don't like the ideas. Right. It is about the power of ideas and the fear of those ideas. And what educators are doing, my own home state is currently debating a bill against the 1619 Project. And amazingly, that bill went down in Arkansas, it went down in Mississippi, and yet Iowa, right, this kind of Midwestern wholesome place, is actually likely going to vote on this. But educators are not sitting down and taking this. Educators don't like being told what they can and cannot teach in a classroom. And they're certainly organizing. And, AFT, if they're interested, should definitely get in that fight.
We will.
I know that you guys want to get to questions. I just want to add to the second part about what they can do, because Nikole, again, laid out exactly what the stakes are. I believe that in many ways, we have to do something much earlier as a society, and particularly as educators, and that is to teach how not to be racist from the very beginning, something I call universal bias education. Because, Randy, if you think about it, it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. the teachers aren't trained to teach this way, and so they have deficits and discomfort, and that discomfort can show up in mistrust. And you can have Black and white parents saying, we don't want anybody talking about slavery. So the problems are already too far gone by the time kids are in 5th grade. The teachers haven't been trained. I believe we ought to commit to committing to something where we begin to socialize children to understand that biases show up at 3 years old. Racial biases show up, gender biases, sexuality biases, disability biases. This would begin to pave the way so that when we start talking about power, when power shows up in the social studies curriculum, when oppression shows up in the social studies curriculum, these kids already, their synapses have already been formed in ways that they can receive that information. The teachers have much more confidence because they've been taught how to deliver that content at much earlier ages. So you're going to hear more from me about this because I think this is an important complement to how 1619 is changing our history landscape.
That's fabulous. And I do think, and I want to get to, and Kelly tells me that this question of mine was a very common one with all of our members who are listening and people who are listening on the platform. I think we often say that we have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, but we often shy away from being uncomfortable and, worried that we'll get in trouble or things like that. So we would love to at the AFT work with you on this and work with others who are being very intentional about getting culturally responsive curriculum or the ability to have culturally responsive curriculum and anti-racist curriculum throughout America.
Great.
Kelly, back at you.
Annie, I'm really glad you asked that question because there's several. Great, thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question, Randy, because there's been several questions about the pushback and then the what do we do if we're not only there's pushback but we're not allowed to teach it or there's states are trying to block it. So I appreciate this conversation and that the AFT. Where I love working, wants to jump into this. So one question, I guess this is kind of like, which child do you like better? Somebody asked, what part of the 1619 project do you believe is the most important to share with students? Well, I wish I could teach each piece, and time is never really on our side as educators.
I'm going to let Nikole off the hook on this one.
I call on one of you?
So I'm going to just say Nikole's essay is really terrific because it's personalized in a way that, say, mine is not, and so many of the other essays. And of course, we know that children learn through stories. And so she offers so many ways to tell the story about the founding of the nation, about the significance of the nation, about the long arc of history. And so if you had to pick one, I'm going to say for Nikole that you should read Nikole's essay. But I will say this, I think that's a cop-out. Because I think the best teaching for any teacher is to do your homework and figure out what you can do best. And so you may find other parts of the project where either by dint of experience, expertise when you were learning as a teacher, connections with your own student population in front of you, that there might be something else. It might be Eve Ewing's piece in the essay that works best for your student. So don't let just Nikole or me tell you what you should teach. Figure it out for yourself. Own it. And if you own it, you're going to do a better job with it.
Yeah. And I, thanks for the endorsement of my essay. What I would just add on to what Khalil said is it also depends what you're teaching. So I know, in music class, teaching Wesley Morris's essay and letting students listen to the podcast is just, his is my favorite episode of the podcast because it takes you through every range of human emotion, but also teaches you a lot about musicality and Black music and American music. I know that literature teachers teach some essays. They teach my essay actually for argumentation because of all the essays, I think mine is the one that is making, most clearly making an argument. Or they'll teach, like Khalil said, Eve Ewing's or some of the other poetry and have students, in literature writing their own poetry. So there's lots of different entry points. And depending on the reading level of the kids, the podcast can be a great way to really introduce them, even over some of the literature.
Great, wonderful. And Fareed, I know you guys have developed all this great content and curriculum and lessons too to go along with that. So maybe I'll just turn to you for a second to mention some of the content, and then we probably have time for one really short question, and then we'll do some final closing remarks.
Well, then I'll just say I'm going to drop the curriculum in the chat. It does have a quote from each essay for you to sort of assess reading level, but I have worked with middle school mostly and elementary age educators who have figured out how to use the essays. It just takes figuring out how to break it down. But I'll drop those resources in the chat, and I'm in there if you're looking for resources in the chat. But more time for questions.
Okay, wonderful. So, just some thoughts on, somebody said, we've been talking about this year that Black history is American history, but we should say American history is Black history. What are your thoughts?
I missed the quip. I've said 1,000 times, anyone will listen, that American history is Black history, because the two are really inseparable. And I think that if we can get, Randy said something at the top of our call, which I both appreciated, but I also want to expand. The 1619 Project is one way to echo this argument, but if we can understand the way that racism has metastasized over 400 years seeped into every corner of American society, and if we can see that through the lens of the last administration as probably the most profound object lessons for our lifetimes, not those who came before us, but for us, then we recognize that every system that functions in our society, systems that govern our electrical grids, systems that manage our water, systems that educate our children as the ones that bring us here today, are all related to the fundamental problem of our original sin of racism. Not something that was aberrational, but something we invested every resource in our society to uphold and to extend its reach even after the last battle of the Civil War concluded. If we can figure that out, if we can come to terms with that, I can guarantee you that either in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, we will see the best that this country is capable of, because we've not seen it yet.
Yeah, I would just second that. The entire argument of the 1619 Project is that America would be unrecognizable, both the things that make this country great and the things that make this country terrible, if it were not for slavery and Black Americans and their treatment and contributions. And that's just a fact. And all of the essays in the argument, in the project, make that argument about different areas of society and that they're connected to that past, whether we acknowledge it or not. One of the things that I say, I wrote the opening essay for 400 Souls, which is Ibram Kendi's and Keisha Blaine's new anthology. And what I say is we're impacted by this past, whether we acknowledge this past or not. It doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can erase it, but we're still impacted by it. And I would just like to close by reading this quote by Edward Ball, who wrote the book Slaves in the Family. And what he says is, reconciliation is not about being nice. It's not about pretending that things were other than they actually were. This kind of reconciliation based upon misrepresentation and the softening of the realities is not true reconciliation, and it will not last. Reconciliation is about being able to look the tragedy of American history in the eye. It's about coming to terms with the violence and the suffering, chaos, anger, and fear in our heritage and saying, we accept this, and together we will transcend it. And that's really what we're trying to do with the 1619 Project, is force a confrontation, not to tear our country down, but to actually force our country to live up to its highest ideals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to take just a moment for any concluding remarks. I think this was a really great rich conversation. I will mention before I turn this back over for anything else, or Fareed, if you have anything to say before I close out and just go over the logistical things that I know people want access to, that the The group chat box, for what I've could watch, and I've been getting lots of notes from some of our Share My Lesson colleagues who are helping run this behind the scenes. So thank you to Amy and Susan and Andy and Susan. But is really some of the most rich conversation I've seen in a very long time. We've always had rich conversations in our chat box, but it's just been so thoughtful and really great just comments. So I appreciate those comments. And what we're going to do is take the transcript from the group chat. I'll remove any contact information, but we'll post the transcript for the group chat in the Share My Lesson resource, because I know there's also been a lot of ideas and resources shared in this chat as well. But we will remove any direct contact information. So Fareed, any closing remarks, and then anybody else before we close this out?
Just to echo Professor Mohammed about the essays are really rich with content. Please explore and let us know if there's anything we can do to support you, and also encouraging educators out there with questions about how to teach this content to consider applying for the network, where we'll be in community to explore those questions together. And I just wanted to thank all of you and to thank our panelists today for this incredible conversation, and would love to hear if either of them have anything else to share.
I just thank all of the educators who joined us today, and thank the AFT for hosting the conversation. And second, Fareed, in saying the Pulitzer Center has been an amazing partner, and there's so many resources there, so offered for free, so please check it out.
Thank you, enjoyed, and so much work to do, so I'm glad we're doing it together.
Wonderful. And Randy?
I just want to say, how we're so grateful to all three of you, and to all the educators that have listened and participated in the chat, and to you, Kelly, for making sure that we're nurturing this platform and being able to do these kind of things in the middle of COVID. But this is a start, not an end, in terms of how we really confront our history and create the kind of critical thinking that an environment that enables this, that is the vision of the 1619 Project. And we're really inspired by all of you, and just really grateful that we have partnered together to do this. And as I said, it's a start, not an end, to what is a really important path of justice and of narrative and of memory and of honesty. So thank you very, very much, all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. One logistical thing, you should be able to download that certificate that verifies that you joined us today for this professional development workshop. So please do that. If you're on a smartphone or tablet, you'll have to come back on at a later date to download it, but you'll get an email from us about an hour after this concludes to download it. And then this will, be available on demand should you want to come back. And I know, I think I definitely want to come back, because there was just some really great points that were mentioned. I am seeing, lots in the group chat, more of these content, more of this stuff that's coming up. So I'm going to ask my colleague to push a slide to mention that our virtual conference, our 2021 Share My Lesson virtual conference, is happening March 23rd to the 25th. And the actual live registration will be live tomorrow morning, but secret for those of you who are here, is probably going to be live tonight. And I want to mention we've got over 40 some webinars that we're doing over the course of 3 days. We've got a lot of content that's focused on social justice issues and anti-racist curriculum. So it's going to be, every year I always feel like we outdo ourselves, and we've got incredible presenters. And this year, again, I'm just blown away by the sessions that we're offering. So I do hope that you join us. We always like to say, now we've been doing virtual conferences before they were like the hip and like cool thing to do. Since this is our 9th year, we used to say that this is a conference you can do in your PJs, but let's be honest, we've been, working in our PJs for the last year. So you can still come and do this conference in your PJs or your work mullet, which I'd like to say is the, business on the top and yoga pants on the bottom. So I do hope that you will join join us for that event. And then, of course, we'll continue to do webinars over the course of the spring. I know Fareed and Pulitzer Center and I have talked about continuing on this journey on the 1619 and trying to bring in some other of the authors that are part of the 1619 project, because I think there's just so many rich essays. So to that question about, what should we teach? I just really think that, I think Haley said it right, or maybe it was Nikole, that, there's some content that you can really pull into different curriculum and content areas, depending on what you're teaching. So I'm hoping that we can continue on this journey with everybody. And again, thank you from all of us at the American Federation of Teachers to all of our participants tonight, and to our presenters. We appreciate you very much. And I hope everybody will consider joining us for the virtual conference in next month. Thank you.
Bye.